We've still got people joining us, so I'm just waiting for the numbers to stabilize and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started now. Thank you everyone for joining us for the Massachusetts Office on Disability's quarterly tea on service animals in public settings. This discussion is specifically for government and public serving organizations and animal control officers to understand how to navigate disability rights and obligations relating to service animals. We've got an image on our first slide of a dog held on a leash walking through a store. As you'll see, we've got American Sign Language interpreters here. If you want to make the ASL interpreter's video appear larger or smaller, click and drag the line between the slides and the interpreter's video. We also have CART being provided. Please click CC on your menu to turn the captions on or off. So the reason for today's discussion is that we hear a lot of people in public-facing roles feel a bit nervous about handling service animals. And the results from the survey that we did for attendees, thanks to those of you who filled that in, very much bore that out as well. While most service animal situations go very smoothly and are easy and quick to navigate, people do often feel unsure how to handle situations where the animal doesn't seem to be a service animal or is poorly behaved. And people can be very scared of making a mistake and getting into what could be an expensive complaint process. So our purpose today is to help you feel more confident about these situations by focusing on what are the areas where we have really clear guidance and it's clear cut and you can feel really confident. And then in the areas where it's a little bit more about evaluating how to approach it without such clear-cut guidance, we're going to give you some strategies to help guide you. I want to point out that in order to go into a useful amount of detail, this is only focused on government and public serving entities and animal control officers and what they need to know. So if you're here as a landlord or a service animal owner or a trainer of service animals or therapy animals, then we're not really going to be able to speak to your questions here in the presentation or discussion. And we recommend that you contact us. You can go to mass.gov/MOD contact us and send us a message and we'll answer your questions properly offline. So who are we? MOD, for those of you who are new to us, the Massachusetts Office on Disability, or MOD, is a small state agency that's a resource to other state agencies, municipalities, and members of the general public. We provide information, guidance, and training on matters concerning disability-related civil rights, architectural access, and equal access and opportunity. No, we're not an enforcement agency, so we don't enforce laws, we simply provide information about the law. Now, this presentation is prepared by the Disability Rights Unit within MOD, which is currently me, Suzanne, my colleague Camille, and Naomi. We provide information, technical guidance, and training on disability rights and physical access, including explaining how disability rights laws apply in a particular situation, offering guidance in navigating reasonable accommodation requests, and providing practical suggestions for addressing a particular issue, as well as directing people to their formal recourse options. We're also, towards the end of the talk, we're going to have Sherry Gustafson from the Department of Agricultural Resources, who's kindly agreed to talk to people about the role of animal control officers and how they might be supportive in these situations. So the structure of our talk today will be going over the basic concepts to make sure everybody's clear on those. And then we're going to look at definitions and laws. This may seem a little bit back to basics, but we think it's really powerful in helping you feel more confident and navigate these situations without feeling you're getting into trouble if you're clear on those definitions. Then we're going to get into the two key aspects of dealing with service animals, whether you should allow a particular animal in, and then how do you deal with behavior issues. We'll talk about some less common scenarios like multiple service animals, then some practical tips, other sources of support, and after the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session, and we're happy to stay on till 2:15 if there are a lot of questions. Generally, it works well to save your questions until after the presentation, as we'll hopefully answer many of the common questions as we go along, but you can submit your questions at any time by typing it into the Q&A. And during the discussion, we'll also allow people to raise their hand and we'll unmute you. So let's get started with the basic concepts. Firstly, service animals need to be allowed almost everywhere the general public is allowed, including places like doctors' offices, parks, libraries, restaurants, hotels. Service animals are the only sort of animal that needs to be allowed in these public serving contexts. That is usually going to be a trained service dog, but you should be aware that you also have obligations to allow service dogs in training and miniature service horses. To work out whether an animal is a service animal, you want to be asking just enough questions to evaluate it if it meets the definition of a service animal. There are two standard questions. Is this a service animal needed because of a disability? And secondly, what work or tasks has the dog been trained to do? If the answers indicate the dog is a service animal, we'll go into that later on, then you let the dog in. Once in, the handler is responsible for keeping their animal under control, which generally means on a leash and not causing disruption or safety issues. If a handler can't get their service animal under control, you can ask them to remove the service animal as long as you offer them service or access without the dog. So those are the basic concepts that you're going to want to make sure everybody who is in a public-facing role in your organization has some familiarity with. And then you might want managers and people at the entrances to know the further detail we're going to go into. And we're going to start with Camille going through the definitions.
Awesome, thank you. So now that we have the basic concepts, let's define the context and some key terms. So for this presentation, we're focused on state and local government, as well as public accommodations. Throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll refer to both of these together as public places. And we're always going to want to start by looking at the context as different laws apply to different settings. So there are 6 main contexts where there are requirements to allow service animals. So do note that this presentation does not apply to housing, employment, airlines, or federal government situations, but we have included a reference slide if you want to look up the laws that apply in those contexts. So for this context, the federal law that we are concerned about today is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II applies to state and local government, and Title III applies to public accommodations. There are also state laws that apply to both contexts. One law applies to dog guides in public places and transportation other than airlines. Another relates to service dog trainer rights, another to hearing dog professional trainer rights. There are links on the slide if you want to look up these and other Massachusetts laws that relate to service animals. And do note that the Department of Justice enforces the ADA and MCAD enforces these state laws, except for the service dog and training law, which is enforced by the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. So when we say Title II applies to state and local government, we mean any service, program, event, or facility offered by a town, city, or state government. So for example, places like public parks and beaches, libraries, town halls, anywhere a state or local government holds a public meeting or event, like a festival or a summer camp. And similarly, when we say public accommodation, we use the Massachusetts law because it's a little bit broader. It means any place that accepts or solicits the patronage of the general public. So this is restaurants, grocery stores, barbershops, etc. This is intended to be read really broadly. Do note that even places that are available by appointment only are still generally places of public accommodation because anyone can make an appointment. So for example, a dentist's office would still be a place of public accommodation. There are 2 exceptions to public accommodations. So these places would not have to let service animals in. Those are religious organizations and private clubs. These exemptions only apply to the religious organization or the private club itself. So for instance, if a business rents out a room belonging to a church or to a private club to host an event, that event would qualify as a public accommodation and they would have to allow service animals. What qualifies as a private club is pretty narrow. So it must be a membership that is truly restrictive with meaningful conditions. Courts will look at things like how selective the membership is, the control of the membership over the club, how the club is financed and run, how often the club's facilities are open to the public. If you're dealing with a situation that you think might fall under a religious or private club exemption, you're welcome to call us to discuss it in further detail. But do note that, again, what qualifies is pretty narrow. So a membership that anyone can apply to without much chance of getting denied, like a museum or a gym membership, even if it's somewhat restricted, like a women's gym, would not be a private club. What is a disability? So under the ADA, the relevant definition for this context is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. You can read more using the link on the slide, but the important thing to realize is that disability is interpreted broadly and that it's not something that you have to get into evaluating with service animals. You're really just going to ask if this is a service animal needed because of a disability, and if they say yes, then you take them at their word that they have a disability. Okay, but it is good to know what generally qualifies as disability discrimination, as these principles can be very helpful to guide you when you're faced with a situation that there isn't specific guidance on. So the baseline is that government and businesses must provide people with disabilities an equal opportunity to access the locations, goods, and services that they offer to the public. It's generally going to be discriminatory for a place to refuse to serve someone or provide worse service because of their disability. This includes creating additional barriers such as charges or unnecessary documentation requirements. Also to separate people with disabilities from others unless it's necessary to provide equitable services. And finally, to refuse to make reasonable accommodations, which are reasonable changes to rules and procedures needed to remove disability-related obstacles to equal participation. So when an animal shows up at your door, there are 4 types of animal that it could be. It could be a service animal, an emotional support animal, a therapy animal, or a pet. a service animal, these are the types of animals that you're really looking for. They're the only ones that have to be allowed into public places. So a service animal must be a dog, or in rare cases, a miniature horse that's been specifically trained to perform disability-related tasks. It must have been trained to take specific actions in response to a command, like retrieve that item, or sense signals, such as a dog sensing the onset of a seizure. The actions that the dog takes in response to the command or sense signal must directly mitigate a symptom or limitation of a disability. The training does not need to be done by a professional, which is part of the reason why there's no official certification, ID, vest, harness, or registry. Do know that there are plenty of websites that claim to register or certify a service animal for a fee, and these generally don't offer any legal benefit. Finally, I wanted to note there are psychiatric service animals that do specific tasks to mitigate symptoms of mental health disabilities, but an animal that's just providing comfort or emotional support by its presence alone is not a service animal and doesn't have to be allowed in. And this can be a little bit of a tricky line to navigate, so it's really helpful to understand the definition of an emotional support animal, which we'll get into in a minute. And you can also see your handout for further examples of this distinction. All right, so an emotional support animal, this is the other type of animal that a person can have to assist with their disability, but it's only allowed in the housing context. So an emotional support animal can be almost any type of animal that provides emotional support to a person with a disability by its presence alone. Sometimes you'll hear them called comfort or companion animals. They're different from pets because the emotional support that they offer helps with symptoms of a disability, but they aren't trained to perform a specific task. Interacting with the dog boosts the individual's mood, or having the dog around helps them feel less anxious. So the dog is helping them just by being there doing the things that a dog does naturally. And these types of animals don't have any training. So you may hear a couple other terms about animals. One of them is assistance animal. That's a fair housing term that encompasses both service animals and emotional support animals, as well as a rare third type of animal that's not a dog or miniature horse, but that still performs disability-related tasks. If someone uses the term assistance animal, clarify if they mean a service animal, as you would still have to allow the service animal in. A therapy animal, these are animals that are trained to provide support to people other than their owner. So their owner does not have to be a person with a disability. You'll often see them going to visit with patients in a nursing home, or they might come to a school during exam week, so they're for other people's use. And a pet is just any other animal owned by an individual. And do remember, of course, an individual with a disability can own a pet as well, and that's why we really ask those two questions. Now that we're clear on the definitions, particularly of what a service animal is, we'll move on to the practicalities of how to deal with a service animal.
So how to deal with service animals. This ends up boiling down to two main scenarios, or at least it's useful to think of it in terms of these two scenarios. One is when somebody enters your business or government offices, facility area with an animal, how do you evaluate whether it is a service animal and you need to allow it in, or it's another type of animal that you don't need to allow in? And secondly, how do you handle problematic behavior? So let's look at the first of those. If a person turns up with an animal and your organization doesn't generally allow animals, we know that only service animals need to be allowed in. And we now know what the definition of a service animal is. But how do we ask questions without being obstructive or invasive, bearing in mind that service animal owners may go into many different public settings in a day, and we don't want to make this really hard work for them. Luckily, the Department of Justice has provided us with those two questions to determine whether an animal is a service animal, and those are our main focus. But first, I want to point out a couple of situations which don't need any questions asked at all. Firstly, we learnt service animals can only be a dog or in rare cases a miniature horse. So if it isn't that type of animal, you can confidently go ahead and deny it access if you don't allow animals. We'll of course want to respectfully explain animals are not allowed except service animals, and if they're not familiar with the definition of a service animal, it might be helpful to show that to them. Next, is it obviously a service animal? Now here we don't mean that the dog is wearing a service animal vest, because as Camille said, those don't legitimize or validate that it is a service animal. What makes it a service animal is that it performs those tasks to mitigate the symptoms or limitations of a disability. So if you see, for example, what is obviously a guide dog guiding someone who is blind, then you don't need to ask them any questions. You can just go ahead and let them in. Now, in the majority of cases, it's not going to be entirely obvious that it is a service animal, but it is a dog. And here's where we use those two standard questions. Is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? If they say no, then you can go ahead and say, sorry, dogs are not allowed except service animals. If they say yes, then you continue to the next question. What work or tasks has the dog been trained to perform? And what we're looking for in the answer are indications that the dog has been trained to take specific actions in response to a command or a signal that they sense, and those actions directly mitigate symptoms or limitations associated with a disability. If you're not familiar with service animal tasks, a quick online search will give you lots of examples of incredibly valuable service tasks that dogs have been trained to do. It can be useful to have an idea of the breadth of those. Now, we're going to talk through an example of how this interaction could go in a moment, but first I want to point a few things out about asking the two questions. The first really important one is that the Department of Justice requires you to take people at their word. So if they say this is a service animal, if they say give you answers that meet that service animal definition, no matter what your suspicions are, you're expected to take them at their word. Now, if their answers don't provide enough detail for you to determine whether the animal meets that service animal definition, you can ask questions to clarify. So, for example, if the owner answers, my dog helps me with anxiety, that could be an emotional support animal, or it could be a psychiatric service animal. So you could ask clarifying questions like, can you tell me what specific tasks or actions the dog is trained to do? And then once they have given adequate answers, you shouldn't ask any further questions, because that could be seen as harassing, and you want to avoid that, obviously. It's helpful to remember that it's not your job to be a medical expert and decide if their disability is real or whether the tasks that they've trained their dog to do are appropriate and valuable. You're just evaluating whether their description meets the definition of a service animal. You must not ask the handler about their disability. You must not ask them for documentation or ask for the animal to perform or demonstrate its work. Camille is going to talk in a moment about specific further questions that you can ask if the animal is a horse or a service animal in training. If somebody is visiting a place regularly over a period of time, you may find that they contact you in advance to let you know of their intention to bring a service animal. So for example, if they signed up for a semester-long class, they might contact you in advance so that you can check if that's anybody else attending has an allergy and make appropriate arrangements to meet both people's needs. But I want to point out that other people's fear of dogs or allergies are not in themselves a reason for denying a service animal access. You are expected to try to figure out a way to allow both people to have access and participate in your services. For example, seating two people on either side of a restaurant. So let's look at an example. We wanted to give you a series of examples of what the interaction might be at the entrance and what sort of wording you can use. We're a bit tight on time, so we've put those examples in the handout that you were emailed. And we hope that you'll read through them and find them useful. We have an image here of a dog walking through a store on a leash. And we're going to talk through just one of those examples. Camille is going to join me and role play the member of staff, and I'm going to be a person coming into her bakery with a dog on a leash.
Excuse me, is this a service dog needed because of a disability?
Yep.
Can you tell me what work or task the dog does?
He reduces my anxiety.
Could you tell me what specific actions the animal is trained to take?
He comforts me. I have a letter from my doctor here that I need him because of my anxiety. I have a disability.
I'm sorry, a doctor's letter isn't going to help unless it describes specific tasks the dog is trained to do. We are welcoming to service animals, but this sounds like it might be an emotional support animal. I can show you the DOJ guidance if you'd like that explains that animals that simply provide comfort are not considered service animals. You're welcome to come in without the dog. Is there somewhere where you could safely leave it?
Okay. So that's maybe a bit shorter than realistic, but hopefully gives you an idea of the sort of language you can use in these situations. I'd like to point out that people may sometimes answer yes to the first question, when in fact it's not a service dog, it's an emotional support animal or a therapy dog. And it's not usually productive to focus on whether that's a lie or not, or an intentional lie. People who have just got an emotional support animal might be a bit unclear on their rights and what the difference is. What's really productive is to focus then on the second question and whether the answers that they give indicate that the dog meets that service animal definition. So we've now allowed a service animal in, say. What's next? Let's look at the entity's responsibilities and the handler's responsibilities once you're kind of inside the building or the property. So your responsibilities as the public serving entity are to allow that service animal to go wherever their handler is permitted to go. That might exclude areas where, the only exception is areas where allowing the service animal would be a direct threat to safety. I'd like to point out in particular, food serving areas should allow service animals, even if other codes specify animals are not allowed. As we said, if other patrons have fears of or allergies to dogs, you need to look for ways to accommodate both parties. You do not have to care for, control, or supervise service animals. That's the responsibility of the owner, and you can ask them to do what's required. If you should not be charging fees or deposits for service animals, even if you do so for pets. In terms of damage, if you normally charge patrons for damage that they cause, you can go ahead and charge for damage caused by service animals. Now, handler responsibilities. The owner or handler of the service animal is responsible for ensuring that their animal is housebroken and that it doesn't pose a legitimate direct threat to the health and safety of other people. They're responsible for keeping their animal under control at all times out in public, and this is key. The DOJ clarifies that means, firstly, that they're on a leash, harness, or tether, unless the dog needs to be off leash to perform their work. And if so, they should be off leash only for the necessary amount of time to do their work. And when that's required, the handler must be able to keep them under control by some other means, such as voice control. Under control also means keeping the animal from disrupting the operation of the business, threatening people, or running wild. The handler must keep their animal from sitting on furniture meant for humans, using serving plates and glasses and whatever that are meant for humans, and riding in a shopping cart. The owner also needs to follow any other regulations applying to their animal, such as licensing or vaccinations. I want to note that's not something a public serving entity should be getting into discussions about. I just wanted to make sure you knew about that. That's something more that animal control officers would deal with any issues around or be interested in. So as well as service animals usually being really well trained to behave well in public, the key thing here is that owners are required to keep them under control. And that's what you can point to when you encounter problems with service animals. So if there is a service animal that is not under control, for example, they're not on leash or a harness or a tether, or they're jumping up on people, barking repeatedly, growling, going after people's food, interfering with the program or service that you're running, or running away from their handler, then what you want to do is ask the owner to get their animal under control. And don't wait too long to do that. Do it as soon as there's obviously a problem. Make sure you explain clearly what the issue is and what behavior you expect. Give them a reasonable opportunity to get the animal under control. And if you have to ask them multiple times to do that, you're going to want to warn them that the animal will have to leave if they can't get it under control. Or if this is happening at the entrance, you know, the dog is acting up or is not on leash, you can deny them access unless they can get the animal under control. Now, if they can't or won't get the animal under reasonable control, you can then ask them to remove the animal, and they need to do so. You can deny access to a service animal or ask the handler to remove an animal immediately without warnings if the animal is not a service animal, if it's not housebroken, or it's a direct immediate threat to people's safety. And this includes repeat visits in the following way. If an individual visits you multiple times, and each time there's a behavior problem which leads to you asking them to remove the service animal, then when they come back again, you can deny the animal access based on that historic pattern of behavior. So you don't have to keep going through it endlessly. Obviously, if the owner says at some point, I've done some training, my dog's better behaved, I will make sure to keep them under control, you're going to need to give them another chance to come in and see whether their dog can be kept under control. But regardless of the progression of events, if you're asking for an animal to be removed, you always want to really clearly explain that you will offer access and service to the handler without the animal present. It's good to say that every single time you discuss even the possibility of a dog being removed or not allowed in. And this slide is really your main recourse about dealing with behavior problems with service animals. Now let's talk a little bit about the service animals owners' recourse if they believe that you have discriminated against them. And their recourse formally is to file a complaint with one of the agencies enforcing the relevant law that they believe has been broken. So this would be the US Department of Justice for the ADA, Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination for the Massachusetts Service Animal Law, or the Department of Agricultural Resources if it's about a service animal in training, which we'll talk about in a minute. When the complaint is filed, generally what happens is that the enforcement agency does a neutral investigation. So they collect information from both sides. They're not acting on behalf of one side or the other. They're neutral. They may offer opportunities for mediation or settlement during the process. And if their investigation ends up finding enough to indicate that discrimination probably occurred, then the complaint moves on to a formal hearing or court. Ultimately, the complaint can result in fines, damages, or requirements for training or new signage. So here's an example of an interaction around behavior. And to represent this, we have an image of a dog sniffing or looking longingly at some food on a cafe table. Camille's going to join me again as the member of staff, and we're going to role play being in a grocery store, and I have a service dog who's sniffing and licking food on the shelves and knocking a few items on the floor. Another customer has seen this and complained about it to Camille, who then comes and sees the behavior herself and then comes up and approaches me.
Excuse me, I need you to keep your dog under control. It's been licking the food on the shelves and that's not hygienic.
Well, he's not doing anything now.
He seems to be doing well now, but we got a complaint from another customer. Can you make sure he's not going to touch or lick any more food?
Sure.
Thank you. But as I reach the end of the aisle, the dog grabs another bag of snacks off the shelf and starts chewing it.
Drop, drop, drop.
Actually, this isn't going to work. Service animals are allowed here, but they have to be kept under control, which includes not licking or touching the food. It doesn't look like he's following your commands and he's grabbing food, so I'm going to have to ask that you remove the dog. I do want to make sure that you can continue your shopping. So if you want to tie him up outside, I can take your shopping cart over to the service counter if you like, so you can finish up your shop without the dog. Or if you're done, I can have the cashier ring it up while you tie the dog up outside. What would work best for you?
I've only got 2 more things to get. Can't I just finish up?
I'm sorry, I'm going to need you to remove the dog now. There are cycle racks just to the left outside that people often use to tie up their dogs. If you want to tie your dog up there, then you're welcome to continue shopping. As I said, I'm happy to keep an eye on your cart while you go out.
Oh, okay. I'll go put him in the car. I hope you appreciate our acting skills here. And we've provided a couple of other examples of that on the handout that you have. Now I'm going to hand back over to Camille to talk about less common scenarios.
All right, so we've gone over some basics, so now we'll discuss some less common situations. The first is service dog and training law. So this law states that a person accompanied by and engaged in the raising or training of a service dog shall have the same rights, privileges, and responsibilities as those afforded to an individual with a disability under the ADA. So I do want to highlight that it says responsibilities as well as rights, because that's going to be very relevant for you. So how are you going to handle a service dog in training? Well, first you're going to start with your standard procedure of asking the 2 questions. And if at any point in those 2 questions they indicate that it's a service animal in training, you can ask further questions to evaluate whether they are currently engaged in the raising or training of the dog as a service animal. And you can also ask if it's housebroken. Do remember, just like with fully trained service animals, you have to accept their word for it. You can remind them that the service animal in training has the same behavior and control expectations as a fully trained service animal. And you can also handle any behavior or control issues just as you would a fully trained service animal. So here's one more example from the handout. In this example, I'm a ranger who comes across a person with a dog walking around a drinking water reservoir where dogs are not allowed. Excuse me, is this a service dog needed because of a disability?
Yeah, well, it's in training.
It's not yet trained?
Yeah,
Okay, so what are you training it to do here at this facility?
I'm training her to walk heel.
Okay, I'd like to remind you that service dogs in training are only allowed if they can behave and be kept under control as much as a fully trained service dog. So that means I need the dog to stay on a leash at all times. The water here is used as drinking water, which is why pets are not allowed. Service animals and those in training are allowed, but it's really important that the dog does not go into the water or relieve itself within 20 yards of the water. Can you assure me that you can make that happen?
I guess.
This is important for everyone's health, so if you won't follow these rules, your dog will not be allowed next time.
Okay, I get it. I'll keep her on leash and not let her poop in the stream.
Okay, thank you. Enjoy your walk. So if you have any further questions about service dogs and training, the law, again, is enforced by the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. And Mike Cahill is the person that you may direct a complaint to. If you are not you, that someone would direct a complaint to if they're refused access to a public accommodation situation with their service dog in training. He's also willing to answer questions on service dogs in training. His email is on this slide, and I think that we are lucky to have him here today to answer some questions in this discussion as well. One final note is that there is no recourse for an entity to report someone who's passing off their pet as a service animal in training. The law just doesn't address this. So if you have concerns about people fraudulently passing off their pet as a service animal or a service animal in training, our best suggestion is to contact the Department of Justice and explain your concerns to them. So miniature horses, we have a photo of a miniature horse here for your reference. These are very rare, and they do have the same handler responsibilities as service dogs. They actually are similar in size to a large dog, but there are a couple more specific factors you're allowed to look at if you ever were presented with this situation. You can look at if the horse is housebroken or wearing diapers, if the handler has sufficient control, if the facility can accommodate its size and weight, if the presence of the horse would compromise legitimate safety requirements, or if its presence would result in a fundamental alteration to the business. Multiple animals. So we have an image here of 2 dogs tied up on the patio of a cafe while their owner is presumably eating at the table that's just off screen. So some individuals might need multiple service animals, such as someone who needs 2 dogs, 1 on each side for balance. You can ask the 2 questions and ask what task each or both of the animals performs. Where only one can be accommodated indoors, staff may ask if it's possible to leave one dog tied up safely outside or in another location of the store or restaurant that wouldn't impede the path of travel. And then there are a couple places where service dogs may be denied. And some of these are related to other codes that would prevent service animals from entering certain spaces. So for instance, for health and sanitation reasons, even service animals are not allowed in the water at a pool. They're allowed around the pool, but not in it. Similarly, they're not allowed in the operating room of a hospital because it has to be a sterile environment, where they are allowed in a general hospital room. There are also some places like a zoo or a state fair where a service animal might not be allowed because it would startle the other animals that are present there. So we'll get into a couple practical tips from MOD. So best practices. You want to start by training your frontline staff ensuring that you have neutral reference materials easily available. It's really helpful to show people that what you're enforcing isn't just your policy, it's the DOJ's policy. And you can also create a bit of a script for staff to use in handling difficult patrons, so they might feel more comfortable approaching the issue. And or you can decide to have a policy that's kind of posted in your business somewhere, maybe with a signage that says no dogs except for service animals. Generally, your starting place is to be welcoming to service animals, and it's going to be really helpful to state again to each person that you are welcoming to service animals and that you recognize their benefit. And then to take a cooperative approach in resolving any issues that arise. Do address behavior concerns early as soon as you see an issue and before people have become, very annoyed by it. Do note that staff shouldn't interact with the dog as it's a working dog. And we also wanted to note that it is okay to ask someone to move their dog to the same extent you might ask someone to move their belongings out of the aisle or walkway. Finally, you can go beyond your obligations, such as by allowing an emotional support animal, but we recommend having a policy so that you can be consistent about this. All right, we'll get into handling difficult situations. So the baseline with difficult situations is to treat people with disabilities the same as people without disabilities. So again, it's helpful to start by assuring them of your support for service animals, to try to keep it simple, calm, and cooperative, to explain very clearly what the issue is and what your expectations are. And if there's disagreement, you can direct them to the DOJ page or to call the ADA line, which we have listed later on. If the animal poses an immediate danger, you can call the animal control officer. And if a patron believes that you're being discriminatory and they say that they want to file a complaint, you're welcome to direct them to MOD, and we can inform them of their rights and obligations as well as where they can file a complaint. On your end, do note the facts of what happened, especially the words and specific animal behaviors, in case there's a complaint made, so that you have evidence that you followed the right process. So now Suzanne's going to go through some sources of support for you.
So hopefully we've given enough detail to give you clarity on how to deal with most service animal situations, but where do you get more support when you need it? Firstly, MOD. We don't answer calls live, so we're not going to be able to help for urgent situations, but we do call you back within about a week, and we can talk through the specifics of a particular situation and help you consider ways to address a disability rights related issue. As Camille said, you can also point patrons to us who are unclear on definitions or what their rights and responsibilities are, or how they should file a complaint. We're not an enforcement agency and we can't give legal advice, but people nevertheless often find it really clarifying to talk things through with us. Next, I'm going to hand over to Sherry Gustafson from the Department of Agricultural Resources, who's going to tell us a little bit about animal control officers and when they might be a useful support.
Sure. So how can animal control officers help in service animal issues? All municipalities are required to have an ACO. The ACO's responsibilities in supervising department may vary from town to town, but they're really a good resource to help with canine situations. If a service animal is posing a public safety risk, the ACO or police should be called. Things to keep in mind is if there's immediate danger, you do want to call 911. In non-emergency situations or non-emergency, use the non-emergency police number, or you can call the ACO line. ACO numbers can typically be found on the municipality's website, or you can look under mass.gov/animal fund under ACO resources. ACOs can often bring knowledge and skills to the situation. ACOs are often already aware of problematic local dogs. They have access to the town licensing list and receive animal complaints. ACOs have valuable expertise and tools for handling unsafe animals. They have their holding facilities and tools to catch and confine an animal safely and humanely if needed. They also have tools such as rabies poles, crates, and muzzles in emergency situations. So when do you call an ACO? If the service animal is being a nuisance or a danger to others, or if the animal is being mistreated. ACOs have the authority under Mass General Laws, Chapter 140, related to things such as dog licensing, vaccinations, potentially dangerous and nuisance dogs, animal tethering and confinement animals, and in addition, they're able to enforce any additional local animal bylaws. So it'd be appropriate to call the ACO in cases of a bite to a human or an animal, a dog being a nuisance, for example, they're running at large and damaging property, an unlicensed, unvaccinated dog creating a problem, or for a service animal being confined in a way that puts the animal at risk. When calling for assistance from the ACO or police, remember, police have the authority to address any Mass General law, and they should respond if the animal is creating an immediate public safety risk, and your local ACO also may be able to navigate an emergency situation. Just make sure when you call, you provide things such as, what are the names of the parties involved? What is the issue that the animal is creating? Has the person or animal been injured? Where is the animal now? And is the situation still active?
Great, thank you, Sherry. I think that's really valuable for people to know about that amazing resource in the municipalities. So finally, we have a few more reputable sources of information. We've mentioned a few times the DOJ's pages on service animals. They have an overview and a frequently asked question. The overview goes through all of those basics about the two questions, the definition and under control. And the frequently asked questions talks about some particular scenarios like hotels and restaurants, and goes into a bit more detail about what under control means. It doesn't answer every different scenario, but what's really valuable about these is you can point to them and say, this is the enforcement agency, they're the authority on this, and this is what they say. So that can be really valuable in kind of diffusing a difficult situation, rather than it being, I have these rights. No, you don't. You can point to the authority, and I've given you links there to their website, as well as links to a slightly older version which works better for printing. If you want to have a version to hand, it can be really helpful to have that bookmarked on your phone or printed out to point to. There's also the ADA helpline we mentioned. I've given the numbers here and their hours of operation. We're also giving you links to MOD's neutral guidance about service animals, not just in public serving situations, but also housing, transport, and employment. And there's a list of all of the Massachusetts laws about service animals. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. I hope that makes people feel a bit more confident about the basic concepts, as well as ways to approach more complicated situations and where to get support. We're going to move on now to questions.
Okay. Hi, Suzanne. So I think this next question is both for MOD and maybe animal control. So as an animal control officer, if the public asks questions about vaccination status and an ACO is called, how do we properly go about it? If not the establishment's worry, would we handle that in private? I've seen this happen once, so I'd like to know how to properly handle it. It sounds like the first question may be about whether Chloe, you might want to unmute, but or someone could unmute Chloe to see if you're asking whether the place of public accommodation should be even asking the vaccination question, and is also the question, would the ACO take the person away and deal with that separately?
If I can try to answer this, and please, if anyone else has anything to say, please chime in. But I would think the situation would really depend on if the vaccination status is an immediate issue with other animals in the establishment or to the service animal itself. So if the animal is entering an area where there's a disease outbreak issue, or if there's a bite incident, something like that. Otherwise, I would think that it would be best to, take the owner aside and kind of deal with that off in private instead of getting the public involved in that situation.
Okay, does anyone have anything to add? No? Okay. Another thing that came up, someone had asked or made a remark about at hospitals that sometimes there are patients who come in who have service animals, and they were inquiring about what their responsibilities are to care for that animal, and they don't have responsibilities to care. But in this particular instance, if it were a person who was coming from a shelter, say, who may not have the means to care for the dog, and perhaps there might be a need for a connection to resources here, of what you would do in that situation. If a hospital provides like a list of dog walkers and things for people who don't have family members to come in because the hospital isn't required to do it. Can anyone speak to any connections? I don't know, Sherry, if you can speak to some ideas for what might happen with someone showing up with the dog that can't be taken care of.
I mean, when it comes to a canine situation, ACOs are they are equipped to handle a lot of those types of situations where they can temporarily take custody if needed in an emergency situation. So you could definitely reach out to the ACO, and if they can't help, they might have a list of resources that may be able to get called.
Okay, so now for some other questions. What if you determine that the dog is not a service animal and the handler leaves the building to place the dog in an unattended car? I would probably say you would do the same thing as if you saw any dog being unattended, not being attended in the car. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that, if there should be another circumstance. I mean, if you're just saying, what would you do if you tell the dog, you tell the dog and the handler to leave and they put the dog unattended and you have concerns about that, you would speak to those concerns in the same way as you would if you saw any dog unattended and you were inclined to call someone. Does anyone have another thought?
I think that goes back to that principle of disability discrimination is treating people with disabilities differently or worse than other people. So if you treat people with a disability the same way you treat somebody without a disability, that kind of helps you avoid getting into hot water.
Okay.
Naomi, can I just because we're getting tight on time, we're happy to stay on, but I want to make sure to answer a couple of questions that people brought up in the survey that we sent out. And one really interesting one was about ambulances and whether they need to allow a service animal to travel with its owner to hospital. And of course, the service animal owner has a right to have their service animal in a hospital and very much may need it. I think the scenario we're looking at here is not the ambulances being used to transport somebody from one place to another at a calm pace and with no treatment going on. What we're talking about is the situation where the paramedics need to be really focused on the person who's being taken to hospital, they might be evaluating them and treating them, and the ambulance is probably going at great speed to the hospital, and it's going to be quite possibly a bit of a violent ride, you know, kind of knocking about inside. And I think the important thing to point to there is the ADA does say that you don't have to allow service animals if it's going to be a direct threat to safety. So if allowing the animal in there, and ambulances tend to be very tight spaces, as if allowing the service animal in there is going to get in the way of the paramedics looking after somebody's health, then you're allowed to deny it. And what you're going to want to do is look for other ways to get that service animal to join them at the hospital. I'm guessing the usual way to do it is to get one of the other emergency vehicles attending the situation, or possibly contacting the animal control officer and asking them, making sure they have the right information about the hospital and the person's name so that they can reconnect at the other end. And I think you can point to not only is this a safety issue for the person being taken to hospital, but it's potentially a safety issue for the dog as well, because these rides can be pretty scary for a person and probably an animal too. So that hopefully addresses that question that we've been asked. Another question, and welcome, if you want to talk through these in more detail, please do call us or use our online form. We'll happily go through this in more detail. The other question we got a number of people asking about was about shelters and how to handle service animals in shelters. And the key thing I want to point out there is shelters are usually covered by fair housing laws, like residential housing is, as well as the ADA. And so they're going to have obligations to allow emotional support animals as well as service animals. And as we know, ESAs don't have to have any training. And so there's even more potential for behavior issues. But as we often say to people in housing or employment situations, you want to be really careful about what you ask when you're determining what sort of animal it is and whether to allow it in. But once you've established that, there's nothing to stop you having a discussion around practicalities like, where is this dog going to sleep? Where is it going to be fed, taken to relieve itself, expectations of behavior, and so on. And so you can have that discussion when they come in, and you have the same recourse that we talked about earlier, that if the animal's behavior is unsafe or extremely disruptive, you do have the ability to ask for the animal to be removed. That's not a great solution for somebody who wants to be in the shelter and has nowhere to put their dog, but you should know you do have that option. Okay, I will step back and hand back over to them.
Mute.
Mute.
So sorry. Hotels and lodging facilities say they have a fee for all animals, including service animals, for cleaning and maintenance. Should you argue or refuse to pay?
Yeah, service animals can't be charged fees. They can be charged for damage that they cause, but they couldn't be charged a general cleaning fee.
So whether you should argue or refuse to pay is, I think we would suggest an approach where you might just explain to them that you can't, you can't impose a surcharge on a service animal, and see what happens from there. And maybe you could point to some DOJ guidance
Yeah.
that we have, and show that to them and see if that works. But I mean, we realize that just someone saying something doesn't mean that they're going to accept it. They may not care what you say, but we're happy to help you troubleshoot through that. All right, let's go to another one. So what do you do if you're asking someone to remove a service animal and the weather isn't good for animals to be unattended, for example, when it's really hot?
I think what they're probably getting at in this question is if the animal is put in a hot on a hot day in a car or a situation like that. I think it would be valid if they have nowhere to put the animal. They might have to leave with the animal to make sure that it's not kept in an unsafe situation. And if the animal is put into a car on a really hot day, it would be really good to call the animal control or police officer. Both of them have the ability to respond. Both of them can enforce the hot dogs in hot car and confinement law, which is chapter 140, 174F.
All right. If a person's arrested with a service dog, would that dog be allowed in the holding cell? I don't think we've had this one recently. So, Sherry, you have anything? I think anonymous person, we're going to have to, can't remember.
That's something I can reach out to some police departments and facilities and just find an answer, because I honestly don't know what the answer to that is. So it's a good question. I think I saw another one that was very similar in the chat for that, but I can do some research on that and find out. And especially if that was asked by an ACO, they're welcome to call me and I can let them know what I find.
Yeah,
maybe we could. Oh,
we would expect as a government, Title II entity, that there would be obligations to allow a service animal, if it was practical to do so without it being a safety issue or undue, fundamental alteration. It gets a little bit tricky in situations where the handler might not be in a position to look after their animal properly. And so I think that's the tricky bit there, whether there's a way of addressing that, and it might depend a little bit on a case-by-case basis.
And I think also in public safety sort of settings, the regular rules of things sometimes change, like if I don't know if there's a holding cell of multiple people, we're going to have to get back to the group with some questions. Okay. We have a scheduled weekly visit by a therapy dog in the building. Does this conflict with our policy in practice to not allow animals other than service animals? Does it send the wrong message?
I'll take that one. I don't think it does. Therapy animals are, a specific type of animal that's gone through a specific approval process to be allowed. I'm assuming that it has. If you're just letting people walk in with therapy animals, that might kind of change your messaging a little bit. But I think that it's fine, if you had another patron who was concerned about that, or who was trying to bring their own dog, saying, these other people will bring their dog. You could let them know that it's gone through an approval process. And that is a situation where you would be allowed to look at, for a therapy animal, you would be allowed to ask about vaccine records and things like that you can't ask about for service animals, since they are interacting with the public. So you can just kind of assure people that you have done, kind of due diligence on that specific animal, and that it doesn't change your no animal policy.
Okay. If someone identifies an obvious puppy as a service dog in training, or even a fully trained service dog, and is destroying property, such as chewing on the carpet or furniture, and the handler is asked to bring the dog under control, can the handler put the puppy on their lap to stop the behavior while seated on a chair? Would that be too close to the dog being on furniture it's not allowed on?
That probably depends on the situation. So animals can sometimes be in an individual's lap. So if you're at a restaurant, then, probably not, because that's getting really close to the food. But, you know, if they were sitting in the library or something, then maybe it would be okay. It just might be more of a case by case basis, or kind of considering more factors in that situation.
Okay. All right, so I'm looking, a lot of people have questions about this being in the holding cell situation. So I think we really need to get back to everyone about this. It's a lot. Okay, how would you address issues with a service animal in a public school setting when other parents take an issue? This might be an offline question because the rules are a little bit more complicated. I don't know whether Suzanne and Camille, you want to speak to it a little bit, or it's probably a lot more than time than we have to go into here.
About schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think schools are a bit of a tricky situation because they fall under the kind of public accommodations law, but the situation doesn't really kind of match general public accommodation situations. And so the legal requirements are slightly different from what you practically actually want to have happen. And so we tend to suggest talking through those situations on a case-by-case basis with us, and we can kind of help you work out a good way to navigate it.
All right. Well, I guess we can do one more. Okay. Someone said they ran into a situation where, and I don't know what the context is, but the person said they have knowledge that the person is not disabled and saying they have a disability and they have to be with their dog. So I don't know if it's a housing setting or it's a public accommodation setting. But I think this was a follow-up question that we had about, you know, taking people at their word if they answer the two questions properly. And that's all we've got. We can't work with something that doesn't exist, you know, that.
Yeah, there's not a legal avenue at the moment for cases where somebody's lying about it being a service animal or them having a disability. We have had some bills put forward in Massachusetts to try and create a fine for fraudulent service animals, but it's a bit tricky to see how exactly that's going to work. That hasn't passed, and the DOJ says that states are not allowed to require registration of service animals, and so this may be something that has to be solved at the federal level. And our recommendation is, if you have concerns around fraudulent animals, obviously first really kind of think deeply about whether this could be a legitimate service animal, because many disabilities are not obvious, and people with disabilities can have a bad day and be grumpy and whatever, just like any other person without a disability. So be careful about your judgments. That if you want to make a complaint about that problem, we suggest talking to the Department of Justice about the situation and the difficulty it's causing.
Yeah, I think we've concluded the questions.
Great. Well, I hope that was really valuable to everybody. And as we said, you should have our slides and our handout, which have our links to the DOJ pages, our guidance, and the phone numbers and contact details if you have further questions. If you have not already, it would be great if you could fill in our survey before leaving, or I'm sure we will include that in our follow-up email. Thank you so much for attending.